One of the things that strikes me when I hear you talk about these things, and you can tell me if I'm hearing this right, or what further reflections you have on it, but in your work, you address a lot of really big and even we could say threatening issues in our world. A lot of things that bring anxiety to people, environmental threats, social
Yeah.
threats. I mean, all kinds of things that can create anxiety and fear. You also talk about, I think the language that you use is how humans are kind of perpetually dissatisfied, and so you have these existential challenges, you have these environmental challenges, all these things
Yeah.
swirling around us, and yet so much of what you talk about, even in this conversation, just kind of exudes these themes of graciousness and the sacredness of the world and the sacredness of life, to kind of talk about one of your books, or one of the titles of one of your books.
Yeah.
How do you hold these things together? The hope and the gratitude for life's gifts, and yet a real and open and critical stance toward the threats, and how we,
Yeah.
as we talk about undergraduate students that have increasing levels of anxiety, for example, how do you hold all that together?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I just finished a little book on hope that I wrote because I have young adult children, and I have a lot of their friends in my world, and I teach undergrads now. I teach a course on climate change to the Duke University undergrads, and I'll tell you the levels of anxiety are deep, and many of them say we're not going to have children, right? There's just there's obviously climate change, which is a huge, huge issue for so many young people. But the list is long, as you say, about social anxiety and political breakdown and oh my, mental health issues. And so, as I was thinking, how do you talk about hope in a context like that? And I learned very quickly, you can't assume that people want hope
Hmm.
because for a lot of younger people, they're deeply suspicious of anybody who says, "Oh, just have some hope now." And it usually takes two forms. One of them is the religious version, which says, "Hey, don't worry, God's got this," which is rubbish. And then the second one is, Elon Musk is going to save
Yeah.
us, which is also rubbish, right?
Yeah.
So there's a technological and a religious kind of escapism that doesn't take the world seriously, and it creates what this friend of mine, an indigenous philosopher named Kyle White, calls the ultimate bystander effect,
Hmm.
where you don't have to worry about addressing the problems of this world because somebody else is going to take care of it, whether it's a technological genius or some big daddy deity in the sky who's just going to take care of all the troubles. And I think both of those are deeply destructive and rightly by young people are completely shunned. They don't even talk about that stuff with me.
Yeah.
So then the question is, well, what's left?
Right.
How do you talk about hope once you've given up those two sort of versions of hope? And I, as I do these conversations with people, sometimes at the end of it, because this is the way that you sort of save all the bad talk you've just done, is you say, well, what gave me hope was X, Y, and Z. And I say that's entirely the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask now is not what gives you hope, but what do you love? And the reason I switched the question now is the question that says what gives you hope makes hope sound something like a vaccine. It's a thing. And if you've got it, you're protected. Or like a security blanket. If you've got hope, you're going to be all right. And I just don't believe that. What you need to be thinking about hope is to say that it's not a thing that you have, it's an action you participate in. And that action is a loving action. And it's not because, there's some sort of romantic notion that I've got going on here that if you do love, everything's going to be okay. No, love is the kind of activity that you do often in defense of what's being wounded, right? That's where you begin to see the need for love in a way that you maybe didn't anticipate it, right? So when I talk with young people, I say, what do you really care about? What do you deeply love? And what can you do to be an agent of healing, an agent of repair, or an agent even of witness in the face of that damage? And when they do that work, They don't know how it's going to turn out because nobody knows how it's going to turn out. But what they do when they give that love to the world or to each other or to their communities, they do the good work that could potentially at least forestall a greater nightmare coming down the way. Right? I think one of the reasons I'm so opposed to even optimism is a real status quo concept. Everything's going to be okay. That's what optimism says. When in fact we know it's not all going to be okay, but as long as you say it's all going to be okay, you've given your excuse to do nothing. But if you say, no, what do we love? You don't have an excuse now. Because if you love it, you're going to do something on its behalf. You're going to do something to protect it, to cherish it. And so the love, right, it doesn't just sort of forestall what could be a much worse scenario. I think what the love does as you're going along the way, you also create joy. Because when you commit yourself to healing or befriending or being an agent of repair, you enjoy the beauty that comes from it. You enjoy the gladness that comes from it. And yeah, there's going to be pain, but you don't need to stress that. Everybody knows there's going to be pain, but there's also going to be real moments of wonder and delight along the way.
Yeah. And would you agree that critical thinking and some of the roles of education also come in here, even with questions like not just what do you love, but what is worth loving, and how do we assess that, and how do we work toward that?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And this is where, you know, I think one of the most important things that liberal arts education can do is it can confront students with themselves, right? And give a multi-textured, multi-layered sort of set of lenses by which we can set the spotlight on ourselves and say, who the heck are we? What are we? And who are we in relation to others? Who are we in relation to our places? So that when we start asking the question, what's a good thing for me to do? You first of all have some sense of who you are and where you are.